So we're seeing all your name up in lights there, so everybody know who is who. Bob, I'm going to start with you first because we've got a really big title there, Investing in the Cities of the Future. We're talking about smart cities, but what do they actually look like to you?
Well, thank you for having us here today, Sarah. Before I get into what we think a smart city looks like, I think it would be helpful to understand that the demand drivers for office have really changed dramatically. Technology, accelerated by COVID, has really had a profound shift in how professionals work. It's given them mobility, and we've seen tremendous migration trends. So, as was mentioned in the prior panel, you don't have to be in Silicon Valley to work for Silicon Valley. You don't have to be on Wall Street to work for Wall Street. And so the demand drivers have changed. It's not just about geography. And the factors that are paramount today include safety, quality of life, cost of living, schools, transportation, and so on. So happiness, quality of life is really driving decisions on where companies and where professionals want to locate. So in the States, a great migration has begun. Large urban cities such as New York, LA, Chicago, San Francisco are seeing significant outmigration and job losses. They are not competing well because of these quality of life and cost issues. For example, New York City has a 20% vacancy rate, and more importantly, and a harbinger of the future, the utilization rate of the existing space is only 50%. Obviously, remote work has had a tremendous impact.
And I'm going to come back to that in a minute because that thought on the secondary cities and that shift from where we're seeing the investment has been quite marked. So we'll come back to that. On a more sort of broad scale, Professor Lanvin, if I can bring you in on this, because in the title there we're talking about the challenges, and COVID has definitely been one of them, and the shifts that Bob was talking about there. But the IMD Smart City Observatory, in your latest report, what are you seeing as the main drivers of those challenges at the moment?
Well, we rank some 130 cities around the world. So we can't pretend to be totally exhaustive. There are much more many cities than that, but we try to have some of them in each part of the world. And the big messages we get is that, first, there is urgency to address municipal issues. By the end of the century, 3 more billion people will be added to the planet, and most of them, if not all of them, will live in cities. We have basically 3 billion people to accommodate in cities. And this is both good news and bad news. It is bad news because the structures are not sufficient today to accommodate them, but it is good news because there are major challenges and hence major opportunities for investment. We have to make those cities not just livable, but sustainable from an environmental point of view, and less unequal, which is one of the difficulties faced by large metropolises that we've just heard about. So the key issues, as we measure them, are number one, cost of living. This is what comes first, by far in all parts of the world, for locals, for expatriates, for investors. The second one is access to basic services. That is, if you want your talent to move to a specific city, you should not be concerned just about giving them the right type of salaries or incentives. You may want them to move with their families, with their partners, because you want them to take roots to contribute to local GDP and not just to the benefits of your company. So that creates new challenges which are only faced by a few cities around the world. Technology is part of the equation, but looking at what cities can do without technology is also important. And just to point at why does all of that matters for investors, I think that we see cities taking roles that used to be those of nation states, more and more. And if that is the case, and that is confirmed in the future, as we believe it will, then it requires higher degree of granularity from the point of view of investors.
And we'll come back and discuss that in a little bit more depth. But Chinhua, if I could go back to that sustainability thread that will carry on throughout many, many conversations this afternoon, and of course with COP28 beginning tomorrow. Carbon emissions, 40% from the built environment, and the demand on resources and services obviously massive given this expansion that we've talked about. We've talked about the challenges, so of course we'll talk about that, but then also opportunity and challenge. So where do you see that opportunity for people to be looking at investing within property?
Yeah, thank you. You're right. I think the cities of the future, you're going to see a lot more people moving to the city. The trend of urbanization will not be stopped. I think there are a couple of things that are important. Building sustainable cities, looking at energy, looking at green energy, how do we reduce the carbon emission? These are all very important factors. Water is also, all these are all very critical resources. And not forgetting connectivity. So we always talk about smart cities. Smart cities by themselves are not sufficient. Cities have to be connected. And more so, even in today's environment where you have geopolitics, it is very important for cities to be connected through fiber optics, etc. So for Keppel, we are solutions provider, and we provide solutions for energy transition. We're very involved in the city-state of Singapore. Singapore is a very small city-state, smart, but we're also building it as a digital hub. We are building a subsea cable linking the United States directly to Singapore. So part of the geopolitics, we are bypassing the South China Sea. So this is something that is a trend in the new world. And at the same time, we are very involved in developing hydrogen as a future source of energy, and of course, importing renewable energy. All of these requires solutions, which actually create these solutions that we create are, in a way, real assets that investors want to invest in beyond just real estate. Specifically within real estate, we also believe that it's not just about building green buildings, but looking at the existing built environment. How can we turn older buildings green? How do we extend the life so that the embodied carbon is not released? So these are some of the things that we are doing, and I believe that there's a great investment opportunity for investors, that you can be green and you can be profitable.
And often, as you say, those two things have been pushed apart when maybe they shouldn't have been. Drew, Global Head of Estate at ADIA, you're sitting on top of all of this with a bird's eye view. How do you see the repurposing of these cities and these trends that we're talking about here?
Thank you, Sarah. You know, the World Bank talks about places that are being left behind. And I think looking at those places, which have significant infrastructure, housing, but cities, for some reason, people have left in droves. I think we're going to be repurposing those cities because so much of that infrastructure already exists. And as more and more people move into cities, with over 80% of the world's GDP produced in cities currently, and that will just grow. I think whether it's the 3 billion more people who will be on this planet, you can't just create new cities from scratch, but you have to look to the past in order to get to the future. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So in the US, that might be cities in the Rust Belt that used to be manufacturing cities for the automotive industry or for other types of manufacturing. And I think those cities are the ones that will be repurposed into the cities of the future.
And Professor Lambert, I want to bring you in on that because traditionally, way back when, you used to think, oh, the bigger a city, the better. You know, it's more cosmopolitan, that it attracts more people in. But there's becoming an anomaly there between the size of a city. What do you see the advantages and disadvantages of that, given the sheer weight of people coming into them?
Well, this goes back to the point that Robert was making at the very beginning of our conversation. That is, we see that there is in an interconnected world post-COVID where you can work basically from wherever you want, especially if you are a higher end type of talent. You know, intellectual potential, you can deliver online. You're looking for quality of life. So whether you can do it from a large city like New York City or Aspen in Colorado or a small village in the middle of Montana depends on the quality of your connectivity. So that already evens out competition in terms of location. What we see in our index is that what we call the second tier cities are the ones which are showing more agility in their strategies to attract talent, to attract investment, and they do it in very clever ways. Just to quote one example among many, Bilbao in Spain, in the Basque Country, not the first, not as big as Barcelona or Madrid, but they've attracted investors in a very clever way. They say, we want to be a carbon-free city. So we give priority to whoever can come as an investor to build any kind of facility that would be carbon neutral or even carbon negative. This gave them an advantage to attract talent because younger people have been attracted by that strategy. It has created a whole different dynamics. So this idea of repurposing, I like the word very much, cities is clearly at the core of these strategies. Bilbao is one example where the older part, industrial part of the cities, called Tabaceria, etc., has been rebuilt, repurposed for venture capitalists, for startups, and it's a marvelous environment to see now.
So Bob, let's dig down on that earlier point that you were starting to talk about, because as you said, the serious money used to go to LA, New York, and the rents are still pretty high from what I can see. But investors are starting to look at those other secondary cities as they were, Atlanta, Denver, and as you said, even further up into the ski resorts and basic places where people want to live. How are you seeing that investment landscape between those two and the flow of money between those assets?
Well, first of all, we would refer to them as emerging cities as opposed to secondary cities. And they are where people want to live, and they are experiencing population growth, job creation. And in cities like that, the best way to invest, besides investing in office, is in the infrastructure, as was mentioned earlier. And that could include multifamily, retail, the various strategies to enhance connectivity. But I get back to the demand drivers, which is quality of life, schools, cost of living. And if you have that, then virtually all the property types that support in-migration and job creation are essential, and they're very profitable.
And the air that we breathe, increasingly important. People are looking at that in terms of sustainability, the ESG, and air quality. Jinhua, sustainability, a big focus for what you're up to. What are some of the game-changing solutions? You kind of gave us a teaser about green hydrogen and various other things. What are the major trends that you're seeing, again, that people can look to in cities and see to potentially invest in?
Right. I think there's no one silver bullet, so everyone is kind of looking at different solutions. First and foremost, you got to look at how to green your grid. So, like in Singapore, 95% of our grid is actually powered by natural gas. Natural gas is clean; it's a transition fuel, but it's still fossil fuel. So the Singapore government is actively looking to import up to about 30% of our power requirement from renewable sources from the region. Unfortunately, Singapore is very small, so we can't have enough place to put solar panels and wind. So Keppel is very involved in looking at how we can import energy in. Now, medium to longer term, I think hydrogen is, as I mentioned earlier, is a real game changer. So we are looking at working with the Queensland Authority government on their hydrogen project to manufacture green hydrogen as well as green ammonia, which can potentially be exported to countries like Japan and Singapore. We're also working in India with a company called Greenco that ADIA has invested in to look at potentially importing green ammonia to Singapore as well. For us, we are planting the first hydrogen-ready power plant. This is something that is quite important because, again, as we talk about energy transition, we also worry about what we call stranded assets. So if you start planting like coal plants today, well, not that you can, but if you did, that would be, the chances of it being a stranded asset is very high. So even for a combined cycle gas turbine plant, we are looking to the future. We are planting turbines that can run potentially on hydrogen. So as the price of green hydrogen comes down, as technology improves, this is where I think where we are all going. Now, last but not least, it's not just about the grid, it's also about extending the life of the buildings that we have. It's in the Far East, it's very common. When a building reaches about less than 15 years of life, we will knock it down. But you look at great cities like New York, Boston, and other places, you've got beautiful cities that have lasted for many, many years. And I think that's the way to go. But keeping the buildings as it is not good enough. In the past, what we would do is do up the lobbies, do up the toilets, stick a Starbucks on the ground floor, and we're done. But nowadays, it's not enough. You've got to make the building energy efficient. You've got to make it smart. You've got to make it connected. So this is something that we are also very interested in because the addressable market is huge. So there's a great investment opportunities for a lot of the investors out there to be part of the green movement, but at the same time, we are creating investment solutions that are profitable.
That brings me perfectly on to Drew's question, actually, because this ESG targets, the brown to green retrofitting, obviously something that's a big theme as well. How much is it going to be that versus new builds, you think, going forward in some of the major cities that you overlook?
Look, I don't think you can knock down all the buildings that don't meet the requirements. I think you're going to have to retrofit quite a bit there. But I think the other thing, building upon what Bob had mentioned, is that, certainly in the US, and I also think in Europe, you've had a period of time where people didn't knock down buildings. And you have buildings from the early 1900s, you have buildings from the mid-1900s that in normal cycles would have been knocked down and more efficient buildings would have been built in their place. And so given the oversupply of office, for instance, given the undersupply of housing, I think there is going to have to be some level of taking things down to then build back up. But what you build, how you build it, with what materials, how you actually push the energy through those buildings, I think that's what's very exciting. And then, realistically, you're going to have hundreds of billions of dollars of retrofits that are going to have to happen to existing buildings because cities like New York and London are starting to fine landlords and owners who don't hit certain carbon neutrality targets by certain time periods. And while I think those time periods will get pushed out a bit because they're a bit aggressive, it's going to force people aren't going to be able to knock them down and they're not going to be able to afford the fines. So they're going to have to find some way to do retrofits.
So hopefully innovation will bring the cost down on some of that as well as we go further forward, which has been a little bit of a handbrake at certain points in the cycle. Bob, we all know the saying location, location, location. I guess the location may be changing, but if you had to put your hand in your pocket now and start investing in certain property assets, what would they be? What kind of areas would you be looking at?
Sure. Well, before I answer that, I just want to add to what the panel has been saying. I think in places like New York City that has a lot of obsolete office space, the parallel is to retail, where e-commerce 10 years ago caused a retail disaster, and it took 10 years in the United States to take care of the obsolete retail space that e-commerce created. We have the same challenge in large urban areas. There are whole swaths of New York City that are obsolete. New York City and these other urban areas will reinvent themselves. They will deal with these issues, the repurposing of properties, but it's going to take a decade, just like it did in retail. So to us, in answer to your question, we would be investing in the lucky and smart cities. So these are the emerging cities in the States. It would be in the Sun Belt. It would be Abu Dhabi that has all the attributes: job growth, a vibrant economy, lots of investment, great place to live. And so look for those emerging cities that have great school systems, safety, job creation, growth. That's where you want to invest, because you're investing with a strong tailwind.
And also grocery-anchored retail and offices, which is a bit unusual. Sometimes people are thinking, everything going online, grocery, a little bit, maybe not to invest in, but you're still a big favorite of that sector.
What excites us about retail, whether it's in the States or anywhere, is the retail apocalypse for bricks and mortar retail is largely behind us. And they've dealt with that. And retail underperformed for 10 years. And now supply and demand is in better shape, and it's essential. And the returns look great, especially compared to some of the property types that have been hot for 10 years, like industrial and data centers. So we like retail.
Sarah, I would just say, I'm very bullish on India and Indian residential. I think the population growth, the education levels of the people who are graduating university, and it is definitely an economy on the upswing, and they are lacking in residential options. So approachable residential, not luxury, not upper middle class, but kind of that middle class, lower middle class. I think there is huge opportunity for people to invest, and we do that quite actively.
And it's interesting, you're all talking about housing at the moment, and I expected you all to talk about tech and all of those kind of investments as well. Drew, and then maybe Chinhua, talk us through the investments in that space within in property.
On the tech side is, given the explosion of the use of data, AI, it has been something that I don't think anyone would have anticipated. And I think if you look back a couple of years, you would have seen dynamics within the data center space that weren't particularly positive, where you had, higher vacancies, where the tenants really had control over rents and development yields, and that has been completely flipped around in the last 12 months. And it's an area that I personally think is very interesting. I think this hyperscale development for the top 10 or 20 providers and users of this data creates a unique point in time, but and I think that will only continue to grow. One thing that I do think that we as an industry need to think about is what's ultimately the takeout for that, because we as investors don't hold assets forever. So when you're done with your investment cycle, if you've built one of these very large facilities, who ultimately is the buyer of that? Is it pension funds? It's not public companies, because there are really only a couple of them left in the world, because most of them have been privatized. But it's an exciting time.
I can see Chinhua nodding away on that. You've gone from an industrial conglomerate through to that asset management. How is that affecting your picks?
Well, I think it puts us in a very strong position, because we look at the real assets that we manage with very deep domain knowledge. So, for instance, on data centers, we've been building and operating data centers for over 20 years. And we are not just a shell and core builder. We actually know how to equip and operate the data centers. We operate about 33 data centers globally. And what Drew is saying, with the AI and hyperscalers, that data centers are getting bigger and bigger. There's always a huge debate. Is it infrastructure? Is it real estate? But actually, at the end of the day, if it makes money, it doesn't matter. But the key point here is that data centers are now it's necessary, because you want a connected world, you have high technology AI, but it's also a bane, because it creates a lot of carbon. So increasingly, it's about how do you supply green power to these data centers. And this is where Keppel stands on its own, because I believe we are the only data center builder and operator that actively goes upstream to look for the green electrons. And then lastly, to the point that Drew made about who is going to own it, we actually have a trust in Singapore that is the first trust in Asia that owns data centers globally. My CIO is also the chairman, sitting in the audience, Christina. One more point I'd like to make on offices. I think office sector as a whole, as we know, is quite unloved at the moment because of all the problems that we've seen. But I think it's often very easy to taint everything with a brush. And I like to highlight that in some markets in Asia, such as in Japan, Singapore, and Seoul, actually the office market is functioning very well. We are seeing good rental growth. People are coming back to work. So it's not like everything is what, and I can understand the US being the largest office market, people tend to look at it as representative of the office sector as a whole. And I just want to kind of draw that distinction.
And no, I think it's a good point, and we're certainly seeing very strong office space prices here in the region as well. I wanted to give the last point to Professor Lama, and also maybe a bit more philosophical, because we've talked about the investment trends there, and they all make sense. And really to a point that you made earlier, and you've written several books on it, the fact that cities are taking on new responsibilities, maybe those traditionally that were taken by a government. And given what we've heard on the panel, how do you see that playing out in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, the COVID has showed us how this was possible. So we've seen countries around the world, I will not name any, where the central leadership really failed. They did not take action on COVID, but cities did. They stepped up to the plate. We're going to see more of that. And going back to the point that Tianhua was making before, that cities need to be interconnected. If cities are going to play this global role I expect them to play, interconnection will be critically important. One element, and I'd like to finish on that, that should not be overseen or forgotten, is leadership. When investors look at investing in countries, they look at the leadership in these countries. When venture capitalists look at investing in the company, they look at the leadership. Who is the founder? Who is the CEO? What is their vision? The same thing is going to happen with cities. And we need to build up the leadership in cities. We business schools like IMD will try to do our best in that area, but I expect that other major business school universities will also carve a niche somewhere to train the leadership of cities.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. And talking about my old IMD, they're back in Switzerland, haven't been back for a couple of years now. But lovely to hear about that roadmap for people to invest in, and also that idea of governments for the future. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for your panel and your contributions today.